The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the Blackwood estate as Jonathan Blackwood stumbled through the grand foyer, his designer suit wrinkled and reeking of champagne. His hands trembled as he loosened his tie, the events of the evening playing on repeat in his mind like a broken record. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Harrison, he called out, his voice echoing through the empty hallways. Harrison, where the hell are you? The elderly butler emerged from the shadows of the West Wing, his impeccable posture unchanged despite the late hour. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his black uniform pristine as always, but there was something different in his eyes, a coldness that Jonathan had never seen before. You called for me, sir? Harrison's voice was measured, professional, yet lacking its usual warmth. Jonathan ran his fingers through his disheveled hair, pacing back and forth across the polished floor. Where's Madam? Victoria should have been back hours ago. Her car isn't in the garage, and she's not answering her phone. Harrison clasped his hands behind his back, standing perfectly still as he watched his employer's agitated movements. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, heavy with unspoken truths. Where is she, Harrison? Jonathan's voice rose, desperation creeping in. I need to talk to her. I need to explain what happened tonight. The butler's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered in his weathered features. Was it satisfaction? Disappointment? It was impossible to tell. She left, sir, Harrison said simply, his words dropping like stones into still water. Jonathan stopped pacing, his face draining of color. What do you mean, she left? Harrison straightened his already perfect posture, meeting Jonathan's panicked gaze with steady, unblinking eyes. She left after you announced your mistress's pregnancy, sir. Took everything with her. 3 months earlier, the Blackwood mansion had been the crown jewel of Millfield Heights, its manicured gardens and imposing architecture a testament to old money and newer ambitions. Victoria Blackwood moved through her morning routine with the precision of a symphony conductor, every detail orchestrated to perfection. She stood in the breakfast room, reviewing the day's schedule with Harrison, while sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the fresh orchids she personally arranged each morning. Her auburn hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, her cream-colored dress sophisticated yet approachable, the perfect image of a devoted wife and successful businesswoman. The quarterly board meeting is at 10, she said, scanning her tablet while sipping her usual green tea. Then lunch with the Patterson Foundation at 1:30. They're considering our proposal for the new children's wing at the hospital. Harrison nodded, making notes in his leather-bound planner. At 72, he had served the Blackwood family for over 40 years, first under Jonathan's father, then transitioning seamlessly when Jonathan inherited both the estate and the family's struggling pharmaceutical company. But it was Victoria who had truly earned his loyalty and respect. Mrs. Chen from the accounting department called, Harrison continued. She needs your signature on the Henderson contract before noon. Victoria smiled, the same genuine expression that had charmed donors, business partners, and employees alike for the past 8 years of her marriage. Tell her I'll stop by the office before the board meeting. And Harrison, please remind the kitchen staff about tonight's dinner party. Senator Williams has very specific dietary requirements. Already taken care of, madam. Cook has prepared the menu you approved yesterday. This was their rhythm, developed over years of mutual respect and shared dedication to maintaining not just the household, but the business empire that Victoria had quietly transformed from a minor regional company into a national powerhouse. While Jonathan focused on the glamorous aspects, networking events, golf tournaments, and business trips that seemed to grow longer each month, Victoria handled the intricate details that actually kept Blackwood Pharmaceuticals profitable. She had never minded the imbalance. Love, she had convinced herself, meant supporting your partner's strengths while compensating for their weaknesses. Jonathan was charismatic, charming, and excellent at closing deals once she had done the groundwork. She was analytical, strategic, and gifted at seeing patterns others missed. Together, they made a formidable team. Or so she had believed. The morning proceeded exactly as planned. Victoria arrived at the Blackwood Pharmaceuticals headquarters, a gleaming glass tower in downtown Millfield, 45 minutes before the board meeting. She used the time to review quarterly reports, sign contracts, and address 3 separate crises that had emerged overnight: a delayed shipment from their European manufacturer, a regulatory question about their new arthritis medication, and a personnel issue in the research division. By the time she entered the boardroom, she had solutions for all three problems and a strategy for expanding their market share in the Southeast. The 12 board members, mostly men in their 60s who had initially been skeptical of Jonathan's young wife playing an active role in the company, now looked to her with the kind of respect usually reserved for seasoned CEOs. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria began, her voice confident and clear as she activated the presentation screen, "I'm pleased to report that our third quarter exceeded projections by 18%. The numbers told a story of careful planning and flawless execution. Every initiative Victoria had proposed over the past year had not only met its targets, but surpassed them. The new research partnerships she had negotiated were yielding breakthrough treatments. The distribution networks she had restructured were operating at peak efficiency." Board member William Crawford, a silver-haired man who had initially opposed hiring Victoria as chief operating officer, leaned forward with obvious admiration. "Mrs. Blackwood, these results are extraordinary. The FDA approval process for the new cardiac medication is ahead of schedule, and our competitors are scrambling to catch up." Victoria nodded graciously. "The credit belongs to our entire team. I simply identified the opportunities and removed the obstacles." What she didn't mention was the countless 18-hour days the weekends spent in the office while Jonathan attended charity galas and business retreats, the late nights reviewing regulatory documents while he slept peacefully beside her. She had built this success, brick by brick, decision by decision, sacrifice by sacrifice. After the meeting, Victoria drove to the Patterson Foundation luncheon, where she presented her proposal for the new children's wing with the same quiet confidence she brought to every professional endeavor. The foundation's directors were impressed not just by the scope of her vision, but by her detailed understanding of every aspect of the project, from architectural specifications to staffing requirements to long-term maintenance costs. "Mrs. Blackwood," said Patricia Patterson, the foundation's elderly matriarch, "your attention to detail is remarkable. Most proposals we receive are heavy on emotion and light on practicality. Yours strikes the perfect balance." Victoria smiled, thinking of the dozens of hours she had spent researching similar projects, consulting with architects and medical professionals, and refining every aspect of the proposal. "Children deserve the very best care, Mrs. Patterson. This wing will provide that for generations to come." By 4 o'clock, she had secured a preliminary commitment for $7 million in funding, more than enough to begin construction. As she drove back to the estate, Victoria felt the familiar satisfaction that came from a day of meaningful accomplishments. Tonight's dinner party would be the perfect capstone, an opportunity to strengthen relationships with key political and business leaders while showcasing the stability and success of the Blackwood name. She found Jonathan in his study when she arrived home, ostensibly reviewing documents but actually scrolling through his phone. He looked up as she entered, his boyish smile as charming as ever. "How did the foundation meeting go?" he asked, setting aside his phone. "Better than expected. They're ready to commit $7 million for the first phase." Jonathan's eyes widened. $7 million. "Victoria, that's incredible. You're amazing." She felt the familiar flutter of warmth at his praise. The same feeling that had drawn her to him 8 years ago, when they met at a medical conference. He had been recently divorced, struggling to keep his father's company afloat. Charming, but overwhelmed. She had been a successful consultant, financially independent but lonely, drawn to his vulnerability and apparent need for her expertise. "The Patterson Foundation understands long-term value," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Speaking of which, how was your trip to Atlanta?" Something flickered across Jonathan's expression, so quickly she almost missed it. "Productive. The Meridian Group is interested in a partnership for the new heart medication." Victoria frowned slightly. "I thought we agreed to wait on outside partnerships until after the FDA approval." "We did, but opportunities like this don't come along often. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks." She studied his face, noting the slight tension around his eyes, the way his fingers drummed against the desk. In 8 years of marriage, she had learned to read his moods, his tells. Something was bothering him, but she couldn't identify what. "Jonathan, is everything all right? You seem distracted." He stood up quickly, moving to the window that overlooked their gardens. "Everything's fine, just tired from the trip. What time are the guests arriving tonight?" 7:30. Harrison has everything prepared." The conversation felt stilted, lacking their usual easy flow. Victoria made a mental note to check with Mrs. Chen about the Atlanta trip expenses, not out of suspicion, but from her natural tendency to stay informed about all aspects of the business. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. The dinner party that evening was, by all appearances, a tremendous success. Senator Williams praised their wine selection. The city's planning commissioner complimented Victoria on her insights about healthcare infrastructure. The district attorney's wife spent 20 minutes discussing their shared interest in art conservation. Victoria moved through the evening with practiced grace, ensuring every guest felt valued while subtly advancing various business and charitable interests. She noticed that Jonathan seemed more relaxed as the evening progressed, his natural charisma on full display as he entertained their guests with stories and observations. This was what they did best together, presenting a united front, complementing each other's strengths, projecting success and stability. Victoria felt a deep sense of contentment as she watched Jonathan laugh with their guests, his earlier distraction apparently forgotten. She had no way of knowing that while she was building foundations and securing millions in funding, while she was cementing their reputation and expanding their influence, the ground beneath her perfect life was already beginning to crack. The first fissure had appeared 3 months ago in Atlanta, in the form of a 28-year-old marketing executive named Amber Rodriguez, who had joined the Meridian Group 6 months earlier. But Victoria, focused on her own responsibilities and trusting in the partnership she believed she had built with her husband, remained blissfully unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse. Victoria noticed the changes gradually, like watching paint fade in slow motion. It started with Jonathan's phone calls, conversations that moved to his private study, hushed voices behind closed doors, and an increased frequency of urgent business matters that required his immediate attention. The first red flag appeared on a Tuesday morning in late September. Victoria was reviewing the quarterly insurance reports when she discovered an expense claim that made her pause. Jonathan had submitted receipts for a 5-star hotel in Atlanta, but according to his itinerary, he was supposed to be staying at the Meridian Group's corporate housing. She called the hotel directly, identifying herself as Mrs. Blackwood and explaining she needed to verify some business expenses for tax purposes. The cheerful desk clerk was happy to help. "Oh yes, Mr. Blackwood stayed with us for 3 nights. He had a lovely suite on the 32nd floor. And may I say, his colleague was absolutely charming. Miss Rodriguez, I believe? They seem to be working very closely together." Victoria's grip tightened on the phone. "Miss Rodriguez?" "Yes, the young lady from the marketing department. They had adjoining suites, very convenient for their business meetings." After hanging up, Victoria sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the expense report. Adjoining suites, for a business trip that was supposed to be a simple day of negotiations. She had been married long enough to know when something felt wrong, but she had also been successful long enough to know the importance of gathering facts before drawing conclusions. That evening, she mentioned the hotel expense casually over dinner. "Jonathan, I was reviewing the Atlanta expenses today. The hotel seemed quite expensive for a 1-day trip." He didn't meet her eyes, focusing instead on cutting his steak with unnecessary precision. "The corporate housing fell through at the last minute. The hotel was the only option." "And Miss Rodriguez? The desk clerk mentioned she was with you." Jonathan's hand paused for just a moment before continuing its methodical cutting. "Amber Rodriguez, their marketing executive. She was leading the partnership discussions. Very sharp woman, helped streamline the negotiations considerably." The explanation was plausible, even logical, but something in his tone, the slight emphasis on "very sharp woman," sent a chill down Victoria's spine. Still, she pushed the feeling aside. Jonathan had never given her reason to doubt his fidelity. They had built something solid together, something worth more than a momentary attraction to a colleague. Over the following weeks, Victoria found herself paying closer attention to details she had previously overlooked. Jonathan's business trips became more frequent, often extending by a day or two for, quote, additional meetings. His phone, once casually left on counters and desks, was now constantly in his possession. He developed a habit of taking calls in his car, even when he was at home. The second incident occurred in early October. Victoria was working late in her home office when Jonathan's laptop, which he had left charging in the kitchen, chimed with an incoming message. She glanced at the notification that appeared on the screen, not intentionally snooping, but unable to avoid seeing it. "Can't wait to see you again? These business trips aren't the same without you, eh?" Victoria felt her stomach drop. The message was innocent enough on its surface, but the tone felt intimate in a way that made her skin crawl. She quickly looked away, not wanting to invade his privacy, but the damage was done. The seed of suspicion, once planted, began to grow. She began to notice things she had previously dismissed. How Jonathan's face lit up when his phone buzzed during dinner. The way he suddenly became interested in improving his wardrobe, asking her opinion on new shirts and cologne. His increased attention to his appearance, longer sessions at the gym, more frequent haircuts, a new interest in skincare routines. Most telling of all was his behavior toward her. He became overly solicitous, bringing her flowers for no particular reason, complimenting her work with unusual frequency, suggesting romantic weekend getaways that he then had to cancel due to quote, unexpected business developments. The guilt was written all over his actions, even if she couldn't yet prove what was causing it. Victoria threw herself deeper into her work, partly to distract herself and partly because the company's success felt like the one thing she could control. She negotiated a groundbreaking research partnership with Johns Hopkins, secured FDA fast-track approval for their new cardiac medication, and finalized the architectural plans for the hospital's children's wing. But even her professional triumphs felt hollow when she went home each evening to a husband who seemed to be mentally and emotionally somewhere else. The breaking point came in November, during what should have been a celebration. Blackwood Pharmaceuticals had just announced record-breaking third-quarter profits, largely due to Victoria's strategic initiatives. The board of directors voted unanimously to give her the title of Executive Vice President, making her the second most powerful person in the company. Jonathan suggested they celebrate with dinner at Chez Laurent, the French restaurant where they had had their first anniversary dinner. Victoria was touched by the gesture, hoping it meant they were finding their way back to each other. Errol. The evening started perfectly. Jonathan was attentive, charming, and seemingly focused entirely on her. He praised her business acumen, toasted her promotion, and reminisced about their early days together. For the first time in months, Victoria felt like she had her husband back. Then his phone rang. "I should take this," he said, glancing at the screen. "It's the Meridian Group. Probably about tomorrow's contract signing." He stepped outside to take the call, leaving Victoria alone at their table. Through the restaurant's large windows, she could see him pacing on the sidewalk, his free hand gesturing animatedly as he spoke. His entire demeanor had changed, his posture more relaxed, his expression brighter, even his movements more energetic. When he returned 15 minutes later, he was trying to hide a smile. "Good news?" Victoria asked, though something in her chest had already begun to tighten. "Very good. They're moving forward with the partnership. Amber, Miss Rodriguez, has done excellent work setting up the framework." There it was again. That slight pause, the subtle correction from first name to formal address, the way his voice softened just slightly when he said Amber. Victoria felt something inside her begin to fracture. "Will you be traveling to Atlanta again soon?" she asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "Next week. Probably for a few days this time. There's a lot to finalize." Victoria nodded, taking a sip of her wine to hide her expression. She had spent 8 years reading people in boardrooms, negotiating with some of the shrewdest business minds in the country. She could recognize deception when she saw it, even when it was coming from the man she loved. That night, after Jonathan fell asleep, Victoria lay awake staring at the ceiling. She thought about all the signs she had dismissed, all the explanations she had accepted without question. She thought about the woman on the other end of that phone call, the woman who had apparently become more important to her husband than celebrating his wife's biggest professional achievement. For the first time since their wedding 8 years ago, Victoria allowed herself to consider the possibility that her marriage might be over. The thought was terrifying, not just because of the emotional devastation, but because of how completely she had intertwined her life with Jonathan's. The company, the house, their social circle, their shared dreams, everything was connected. But Victoria hadn't built a pharmaceutical empire by avoiding difficult realities. If her marriage was in trouble, she needed to know the extent of the damage, and if Jonathan was having an affair, she needed to decide what she was going to do about it. The next morning, Victoria made a phone call to a private investigator she had used occasionally for corporate background checks. She hated herself for doing it, felt like she was betraying everything she believed about trust and marriage. But she also knew that she couldn't continue living in uncertainty. "I need you to look into something personal," she told Detective Sarah Martinez. "Completely confidential. I think my husband might be having an affair." As she hung up the phone, Victoria felt a strange sense of relief mixed with dread. Whatever the truth was, at least she would finally know it. And knowing the truth, no matter how painful, was always better than living a lie. She had no idea that the truth would be far worse than anything she had imagined. 6 months after walking out of the Blackwood mansion, Victoria stood in the penthouse office of Sterling Enterprises, watching the sunrise paint the city's skyline in shades of gold and amber. The view from the 42nd floor was spectacular, but it wasn't the height that gave her the greatest satisfaction. It was the knowledge that she had earned every square foot of this space through her own merit and determination. The transformation had been remarkable. What started as a calculated escape had evolved into something far more powerful, a complete rebirth. Sterling Enterprises, the consulting firm she had established with her own resources and connections, was now one of the most sought-after strategic advisory companies on the East Coast. Fortune 500 companies competed for her attention, and her reputation for turning around failing businesses had spread throughout the industry. Victoria had discovered something liberating about building a company from scratch. Without the weight of family legacy or the burden of protecting someone else's ego, she could implement strategies with ruthless efficiency. She hired the best talent, regardless of their background or connections. She streamlined operations without having to justify every decision to a board of directors who owed their positions to nepotism rather than competence. Her assistant, James Chen, a brilliant MBA graduate she had poached from a top consulting firm, knocked on her office door. "Mrs. Sterling, you have the Meridian Group meeting in 20 minutes, and Detective Martinez is here to see you." Victoria smiled at the name she had legally reclaimed after the divorce. Margaret Sterling had been her grandmother's maiden name, a successful businesswoman who had built a small empire in real estate during the 1940s when few women were taken seriously in business. The name felt like armor, protective, powerful, and entirely her own. Send Detective Martinez in first and push the Meridian meeting back by 15 minutes. Sarah Martinez entered the office looking pleased with herself, carrying a thick folder that Victoria suspected contained the final piece of the puzzle she had been assembling for months. "You're going to enjoy this," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from Victoria's desk. "Jonathan's world is about to come crashing down in ways he never imagined." Victoria poured 2 cups of coffee from the elegant service on her credenza. "Tell me everything." First, the pregnancy announcement at the charity gala. Complete fabrication. Amber Rodriguez was never pregnant. It was all an elaborate scheme to force you out so they could take complete control of Blackwood Pharmaceuticals. Victoria felt a cold satisfaction settle in her chest. She had suspected as much, but having confirmation was still gratifying. And the evidence? Medical records, courtesy of a very cooperative doctor who got tired of being asked to falsify pregnancy tests. Amber Rodriguez has been on birth control the entire time she's been involved with Jonathan. The whole pregnancy was staged to manipulate you into leaving without fighting for your share of the company. Sarah opened the folder and spread several documents across Victoria's desk. But that's just the beginning. Remember how you mentioned that Jonathan seemed unusually interested in expanding the international division right before you left? He kept talking about opportunities in South America and Eastern Europe. Well, those opportunities were very real, but not in the way he claimed. Jonathan and Amber have been using Blackwood Pharmaceuticals as a front for money laundering. They've been selling expired medications to overseas distributors, then reporting them as charitable donations for tax purposes, while pocketing the actual sale proceeds. Victoria studied the financial documents Sarah had obtained. The scope of the fraud was staggering. Millions of dollars siphoned through fake charitable organizations and shell companies. How long has this been going on? At least 2 years, possibly longer. The really interesting part is that they've been using your reputation and the company's credibility to legitimize their operations. Your success with the cardiac medication approval gave them the perfect cover. Who would suspect a company with such strong FDA relationships of running illegal operations? The irony wasn't lost on Victoria. While she had been working tirelessly to build the company's reputation and ensure regulatory compliance, her own husband had been using her efforts to provide cover for criminal activity. "There's more," Sarah continued. "The Meridian Group partnership that Jonathan was so excited about? It's not a pharmaceutical company at all. It's a front operation run by a consortium of investors who specialize in corporate takeovers. The plan was to merge Blackwood with Meridian, then systematically strip the company's assets and sell off the pieces." Victoria leaned back in her chair, processing the full scope of the betrayal. It wasn't just adultery. It was a calculated plan to destroy everything she had built while stealing the profits for themselves. And Amber Rodriguez? She's been working for the Meridian Group the entire time. Her job was to seduce Jonathan and manipulate him into cooperating with their takeover plan. The affair wasn't a crime of passion. It was a business strategy. Victoria felt a strange sense of vindication. As painful as Jonathan's betrayal had been, learning that he had been manipulated by professionals made his weakness seem almost pitiable rather than purely malicious. "What's their current situation?" Sarah grinned. "That's the best part. Without you managing the day-to-day operations, Blackwood Pharmaceuticals has been hemorrhaging money. The FDA launched an investigation into their quality control procedures after several batches of medication failed inspection. Jonathan has been trying to handle the regulatory response himself, and he's completely out of his depth. And the financial situation? Desperate. They've been borrowing against the company's assets to fund their lifestyle and pay off the Meridian Group. The mansion is mortgaged to the hilt, and they've maxed out every line of credit. If they can't turn things around in the next 60 days, they'll lose everything." Victoria stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city she had conquered through skill and determination rather than marriage and manipulation. The view was intoxicating, but not as satisfying as what was about to happen next. "James mentioned the Meridian Group is here for a meeting?" Sarah nodded. "They want to hire Sterling Enterprises to help them restructure their pharmaceutical division. Apparently, they've heard about your expertise in the industry." Victoria laughed, a genuine sound of amusement and anticipation. "They want me to help them fix the company they're trying to steal from my ex-husband? They have no idea who you are. You've been operating under the Sterling name, and your business profile doesn't mention your previous marriage. To them, you're just a successful consultant with pharmaceutical expertise." Victoria returned to her desk and picked up the phone. "James, send the Meridian Group representatives in, and call the FBI Financial Crimes Division. Tell them I have information about a money laundering operation they'll find very interesting." As she prepared to meet with the people who had orchestrated her personal and professional destruction, Victoria felt a calm sense of purpose settle over her. She had spent months building the weapons she would need for this moment: financial independence, industry connections, legal evidence, and most importantly, a reputation for integrity that would make her word unquestioned when she chose to destroy theirs. The meeting with the Meridian Group was almost anticlimactic. The three executives who entered her office were exactly what she had expected: slick, arrogant, and completely confident in their ability to manipulate anyone they encountered. They had no idea they were walking into a trap that had been months in the making. Victoria listened politely as they outlined their plans for acquiring and restructuring Blackwood Pharmaceuticals. They spoke about Jonathan with barely concealed contempt, referring to him as manageable and useful for transition purposes. They had no idea that every word they spoke was being recorded by the sophisticated surveillance system she had installed in her office. When they finished their presentation, Victoria smiled graciously. "Gentlemen, I'm very interested in working with you. In fact, I believe I can offer you insights into Blackwood Pharmaceuticals that you won't find anywhere else." As they shook hands and scheduled follow-up meetings, Victoria felt the final pieces of her plan clicking into place. Within 48 hours, the FBI would have everything they needed to shut down the Meridian Group's operations and arrest everyone involved in the money laundering scheme. Jonathan and Amber would face federal charges, and Blackwood Pharmaceuticals would be seized as evidence. But Victoria's revenge would be more complete than simple justice. She had already contacted the company's legitimate pharmaceutical patents and developed plans to acquire them through the federal asset seizure auction. The cardiac medication she had developed, the research partnerships she had negotiated, the distribution network she had built, all of it would become part of Sterling Enterprises. 6 months ago, she had been a woman betrayed, cast aside by people who thought she was powerless without their name and connections. Now she was a force of nature, capable of destroying the lives of anyone who underestimated her. That evening, Victoria returned to her elegant townhouse in the city's historic district, a far cry from the ostentatious mansion she had shared with Jonathan, but infinitely more satisfying because it was entirely hers. As she poured herself a glass of wine and settled into her reading chair, her phone rang. "Mrs. Sterling, this is Harrison. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I thought you should know. Mr. Blackwood came home tonight to find FBI agents waiting for him." Victoria smiled, hearing the satisfaction in the elderly butler's voice. Harrison had been one of the few people who had treated her with genuine respect during her marriage, and she had made sure he was well provided for when she established her new life. "Thank you for letting me know, Harrison. How are you settling into retirement?" "Very well, thank you. The house you helped me purchase is perfect, and the pension you arranged is more than generous." After hanging up, Victoria sat in her perfectly appointed living room, surrounded by books she had chosen, art she had purchased, and furniture that reflected her taste rather than someone else's family legacy. Tomorrow, the newspapers would be full of stories about the downfall of Jonathan Blackwood and the criminal conspiracy that had nearly destroyed one of the region's most respected pharmaceutical companies. But tonight, Victoria Sterling simply enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had built something magnificent from the ashes of her former life. She had learned that the most powerful revenge wasn't destruction, it was transformation. She hadn't just defeated her enemies, she had become someone they could never touch again. In the end, Jonathan Blackwood had done her the greatest favor of his life by betraying her. He had forced her to discover just how powerful she could be when she stopped trying to make herself smaller to fit into someone else's vision of who she should be. The woman who had once asked, "Where's Madam?" was gone forever, replaced by someone far more dangerous and infinitely more capable. Victoria Sterling had arrived, and the business world would never be the same. 3 weeks after the arrests, Victoria received an unexpected visitor. She was reviewing acquisition proposals in her office when James announced that Arthur Blackwood, Jonathan's father, was requesting a meeting. Victoria hadn't spoken to the elderly patriarch since the divorce, but curiosity compelled her to agree. Arthur entered her office looking every one of his 78 years. His once imposing frame was now stooped with age and stress, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his diminished form. The man who had once looked down on her as an unworthy addition to his family legacy now stood before her as a supplicant. "Victoria," he began, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I'm desperate." She gestured to the chair across from her desk, studying the man who had never shown her genuine warmth during the 8 years she had been married to his son. "What can I do for you, Arthur? The family has lost everything. The house, the cars, even Dorothy's jewelry, all seized by the federal government. They've frozen every account, every asset. Dorothy is staying with her sister in Ohio, and I'm living in a one-bedroom apartment downtown." Victoria felt no satisfaction in his misery, only a cold objectivity that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm not sure how this concerns me." Arthur leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "You were always the smartest person in our family, even when we were too proud to admit it. You understood the business, the connections, the intricate relationships that kept everything running. Without you, Jonathan never stood a chance. Arthur, your son chose to commit federal crimes. He chose to betray not just me, but everyone who trusted him with their investments, their health, their livelihoods. These consequences are the result of his decisions, not mine." "I know," Arthur said quietly. "I know we failed you. I know we took your contributions for granted and treated you as less than you deserved. But Victoria, there's something you need to understand about Jonathan's childhood, about the pressure we put on him." Victoria raised an eyebrow, curious despite herself. Jonathan was never cut out for business leadership. He was artistic, creative, more interested in music and literature than profit margins and strategic planning. But when my father built this company, he established a tradition that the firstborn son would inherit the leadership role, regardless of aptitude or interest. Arthur's voice grew heavy with regret. "I pushed Jonathan into a role he never wanted, forced him to be someone he wasn't capable of being. When you came along and showed such natural talent for the work, part of me was relieved. Finally, someone who could handle the responsibilities he couldn't manage alone. Then why didn't you support me more openly? Why did you let him marginalize my contributions?" "Pride," Arthur admitted. "Stubborn, foolish pride. I couldn't admit that a woman who had married into the family was more capable than the heir I had spent decades grooming. I thought if I could just give Jonathan more time, more guidance, he would eventually rise to the challenge." Victoria processed this information, understanding for the first time some of the dynamics that had shaped her marriage. Jonathan's insecurity, his need to prove himself, his resentment of her competence, it all made more sense now. "I'm not asking you to forgive him," Arthur continued. "What he did was unforgivable. But I am asking you to consider the possibility that his crimes were as much about desperation and inadequacy as they were about greed." "What exactly are you asking me to do, Arthur?" "The government is auctioning off the company's assets next month. You have the resources and the connections to acquire them. If you do, you could rebuild Blackwood Pharmaceuticals the right way, your way. The employees who lost their jobs when the company collapsed, the patients who depended on our medications, the research partnerships that are now in limbo. You could restore all of that. Victoria stood and walked to her window, considering Arthur's words. She had already planned to bid on the pharmaceutical patents and key assets, but she had been thinking in terms of strategic acquisition rather than restoration. And what would you want in return for this suggestion? Nothing for myself, Arthur said quickly. I'm too old to start over, and I've made peace with losing everything. But Dorothy. She's 74 years old, Victoria. She had nothing to do with Jonathan's crimes, but she's lost her home, her security, her entire way of life. Victoria turned back to face him. Dorothy Blackwood had never been warm toward her, but she had also never been deliberately cruel. She was a product of her generation and social class, reserved, traditional, but not malicious. You want me to provide for your wife? I'm asking you to consider showing mercy to an old woman who has lost everything through no fault of her own. You have the power to be generous without it costing you anything meaningful. Victoria returned to her desk, studying Arthur's face. The request was reasonable, and the gesture would demonstrate the kind of leadership she wanted to embody as she built her new empire. I'll make you a deal, Arthur. I will ensure that Dorothy has a comfortable apartment and sufficient income for the rest of her life. In return, I want you to do something for me. Arthur straightened, hope flickering in his tired eyes. Anything. When the trial begins, I want you to testify about Jonathan's psychological state, his inadequacy for leadership, and his susceptibility to manipulation. I want the court to understand that while his crimes were serious, they were also the result of a man who was fundamentally unprepared for the responsibilities thrust upon him. You want me to help reduce his sentences? I want the truth to be told. Jonathan made terrible decisions, but he was also a victim of expectations he could never meet and manipulation by people far more sophisticated than he was. A 20-year federal sentence won't serve anyone's interests, but a 5-year sentence with mandatory psychological counseling might actually help him become a better person. Arthur's eyes filled with tears. You would do that? After everything he put you through? I'm not doing it for him, Victoria said firmly. I'm doing it because I believe in justice, not revenge. And I'm doing it because the woman I've become is someone who has the strength to show mercy when it's warranted. 2 months later, Victoria stood in the same federal courthouse where Jonathan's trial was concluding. She had testified as a character witness, describing his contributions to the company alongside his limitations and vulnerabilities. Her measured professional testimony had carried significant weight with the jury and judge. Jonathan received a 7-year sentence with eligibility for parole in 5 years, contingent on completing psychological counseling and community service. Amber Rodriguez, as the primary architect of the conspiracy, received 15 years without parole. The Meridian Group executives faced various sentences ranging from 12 to 25 years. As Victoria left the courthouse, she felt a sense of closure that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice properly served. She had helped ensure that the punishment fit the crime while also protecting the innocent victims of Jonathan's poor decisions. 6 months later, Sterling Pharmaceuticals, the company she had built from the acquired assets of Blackwood Pharmaceuticals, announced the successful completion of Phase 3 trials for a revolutionary diabetes medication. The drug promised to transform treatment for millions of patients worldwide, and early projections suggested it would generate billions in revenue over the next decade. We did. But opportunities like this don't come along often. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks. She studied his face, noting the slight tension around his eyes, the way his fingers drummed against the desk. In 8 years of marriage, she had learned to read his moods, his tells. Something was bothering him, but she couldn't identify what. Jonathan, is everything all right? You seem distracted. He stood up quickly, moving to the window that overlooked their gardens. Everything's fine, just tired from the trip. What time are the guests arriving tonight? 7:30. Harrison has everything prepared. The conversation felt stilted, lacking their usual easy flow. Victoria made a mental note to check with Mrs. Chen about the Atlanta trip expenses, not out of suspicion, but from her natural tendency to stay informed about all aspects of the business. Victoria stood before a packed auditorium at the annual American Pharmaceutical Association conference, delivering the keynote address that would establish her as one of the industry's most visionary leaders. Her speech focused on ethical leadership, corporate responsibility, and the importance of putting patient welfare above profit margins. The pharmaceutical industry has the power to heal or to harm, she told the audience of executives, researchers, and healthcare professionals. Our choice of priorities, profit or people, short-term gains or long-term sustainability, personal advancement or collective progress, determines which legacy we leave behind. As applause filled the auditorium, Victoria thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost a marriage but gained an empire. She had been betrayed by people she trusted, but discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. She had been cast aside as expendable, but had proven herself indispensable to an entire industry. The woman who had once defined herself through her relationship to others had become someone who stood entirely on her own merits. Victoria Sterling was no longer anyone's wife, daughter-in-law, or supporting character. She was the protagonist of her own story, and that story was just beginning. That evening, as she returned to her penthouse office to review the next day's strategic planning session, Victoria reflected on how completely her life had transformed. She commanded respect not because of who she had married, but because of what she had built. Her success wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval or support. It was entirely her own creation. The phone on her desk rang, interrupting her thoughts. James had left for the day, so she answered it herself. Victoria Sterling. Miss Sterling, this is Harrison. I hope I'm not calling too late, but I wanted to congratulate you on your speech today. I watched it online, and I have never been more proud to have known you. Victoria smiled, genuinely touched by the call from the man who had been one of her few allies during the darkest period of her life. Thank you, Harrison. That means more to me than you know. I also wanted you to know that I saw Mr. Jonathan yesterday. He's been released to a halfway house and is working at a community center, teaching music to underprivileged children. He asked me to tell you that he's grateful for your testimony at his trial and that he's finally doing work that feels meaningful to him. Victoria felt a surprising sense of peace at this news. Perhaps Arthur had been right about Jonathan's true nature. Perhaps being freed from the expectations and pressures that had driven him to crime would allow him to discover who he really was. Thank you for letting me know, she said. I hope he finds happiness in his new life. After hanging up, Victoria returned to her planning documents, but her mind lingered on the conversation. She had built something magnificent from the destruction of her old life, but perhaps Jonathan would do the same. Perhaps they had both needed to lose everything they thought they wanted in order to discover what they actually needed. The city lights twinkled below her windows as Victoria Sterling, pharmaceutical executive and industry visionary, continued planning the future she would build entirely on her own terms. She had answered the question, "Where's Madam?" with something far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. Madam had not simply left. She had been transformed into something extraordinary. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.